One of the serendipitous parts of researching for these episodes is that other terms and topics come up that I hadn't considered or perhaps even heard of, but are thought provoking nonetheless and certainly worth exploring. And when I talk about serendipity, I'm referring to that happy accident and not the restaurant in New York by the same name. But as a side note, if you are really into dessert, I really suggest if you are ever in New York, do make a visit. You won't be disappointed. So one such serendipitous topic that's quietly sitting under a lot of male anxiety right now is what's known as the provider role. And it is a term that I hadn't really heard until recently. It does make perfect sense. I just never had it clearly defined to me. So for most of modern history, a man's identity was very, very simple in structure. It wasn't easy in terms of the amount of effort he had to put in, but it was simpler to define. And it was provide, protect, and produce results. And whether we liked it or not, that's how we measured ourselves. But we're living in very, very different economic and cultural times now. So society has morphed. Women are graduating from university at higher rates. In many, many cities, women in their 20s out-earn men. Dual income households are the norm. And, financial independence is celebrated, and quite rightly. So that creates the question, if a man is no longer needed as the primary provider, where does that leave him? So is the provider role outdated, or is it more psychologically essential than we could admit? So you're very welcome to the Men We Are podcast. This is a podcast for men that maybe have a niggling feeling, a few things they're confused about, things about their lives or their identity as a man within modern society they're not quite sure about. They have questions and they just want to delve into some of those topics. So that's what we're going to do here. And as I said, today's all about the provider role. So this provider role came from, well, it's fairly obviously historic in that it wasn't just cultural preference, but it was economically necessary. And industrialization, it separated the workplace and the home. So men worked outside, they were part of the workforce in industry, and women, they stayed inside, they managed domestic labor inside, they were part of the home-based workforce. So the sociologist Talcott Parsons, he described this as instrumental versus expressive role distinction. And what it was men took on that instrumental role. They had to go and get the income and create the external stability. Women took the expressive role, more emotional and relational management. Effectively, the men went out and earned the money. The women stayed at home and they spent the money. They budgeted for the household. Now, we're not getting into the morality of that setup. We're just acknowledging the fact that it was very, very structurally clear. If we fast forward to today, however, the economy has changed. Education's changed. Gender norms have changed. The result of which is identity questions begin to be asked. And for me, growing up in the 80s, my father was in the police. And there were a lot of strikes around, the miner strikes, the gas worker strikes, the steel worker strikes, and the police were used, crowd control, that sort of thing. So my father being in the police, he'd get picked up on a Sunday night. He'd spend a week away in a tent with people he potentially didn't know. He'd be returned on a Friday evening or early Saturday morning. So to me, throughout the period of, I was very, very young. I was maybe 3, 4, 5 years old. My father's role was the provider, and he disappeared for most of the week, but the money kept coming in. And my mother would just say, Daddy's gone to work. That's how we have a roof over our head. That's how we have a house. And on reflection, a part of me has grown into that too, like with long haul flying necessitating me heading off for 5, 6, 7 days at a time. And for so long, I have suppressed how that actually made me feel. I always try to lean into the fun and the excitement. I get to go and explore, and I am one of those crew down route that, I like. Certainly very, very recently, I really prioritize sleep so that I can get up early in the morning and go and explore the places. And I always try to ignore the feelings of loneliness and disconnection that were going along with spending that amount of time away. Because I always felt that my role as a man was to provide a nice home, put money in the bank, and do all of that without fuss or complaint. And I'm definitely not alone with assumptions and interpretations like that, as the psychology proves, because there's consistent data that shows that men's self-esteem is more strongly correlated with income and employment status than women's is. And that ego boosting from seeing ourselves as successfully carrying out that provider role, providing this role that we feel is hardwired into us, it does go some way to silence those negative aspects of missing out, of being away, etc. So for many men, earning isn't just practical, it's existential, which means it does lead to a more delicate matter where studies from institutions like the American Psychological Association have shown that men experience higher rates of depression and identity disturbance following a job loss when compared to women. And it's not because women don't suffer financially, of course they do, but it's because men often experience unemployment as a loss of their identity. And I can 100% buy into this because I had such an argument with a really great friend of mine on this very subject. And I qualify her as a great friend because she wasn't willing to let me off the hook when I didn't like how things were going with the argument. It wasn't an argument, it was a debate, let's say. But when asked who I thought I was, I defined myself as a pilot. And she kept pushing me, but who are you really? And I just couldn't get beyond it because I really thought the stable traits of being a pilot were a good reflection of a person, like calmness under pressure, drive to take on challenge, intellectual thinking, responsibility. But no, who are you really? Kept going. And it only dawned on me later that being a pilot is not who I am. It's not how I feel. Even it's not what I am, it's just what I do. And without labouring the memory, in that very moment, if I had been sacked for some reason, I would have been so incredibly devastated because I had aligned my entire identity with my career. But now, if it happened, if I got sacked today, such is the change in me, not only from this journey, but also from experiences with my job. Yeah, of course, I'd be upset, but I wouldn't be devastated because although flying airplanes is great fun, I really love it. I love the fact that I get to do something I enjoy and I get paid to do it. It puts lots of money in the bank to pay for things like mortgages and, healthcare, etc. It's just what I do and it's not who I am. Now, unfortunately, I don't think anyone will pay me for that. So for the moment, I'll stay as a pilot. But psychologist Roy Baumeister, he's written extensively about the human need for meaning, competence, and contribution. So for many men, providing equals contribution. So if you take that away from them or, even dilute it, this can lead to men feeling really irrelevant. So imagine if you're experiencing some difficult feeling surrounding your identity and relevance, but you find yourself in a modern household where the woman of the household, she out-earns the man. Well, there is research, it's published in journals like Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, that's shown that in some relationships where the woman is the primary earner, both partners can experience subtle psychological strain. And it's often because of those lingering social expectations. And that's even when the couples consciously reject traditional roles. The unconscious script still seems to linger in the background. And this is even more damning that economist Marianne Bertrand, she conducted research and she showed that marriage rates dip when a woman's income surpasses a male partner by a certain margin. Almost like couples don't take that next step of becoming married because the woman is in that role. And also with this, it has led to separation and divorce. Now, it's not universal, but it is certainly statistically measurable. And this suggests something important that, cultural expectations aren't able to shift as quickly as economic structures do. So if a man feels threatened by a successful woman, yeah, for me, that's an insecurity worth examining. But if a man feels disorientated because the role he was prepared for no longer applies or maybe no longer exists, that's a need for him to transition. And in order to transition, you need to have a clear idea of what you're transitioning to. So you need a redefinition. But what you certainly don't need is denial. So as a younger man, much younger, before I began flying, I worked as an air traffic controller, which is an awesome career. It's really exciting, really challenging. It's basically the biggest computer game. Keep the little blips from bumping into each other. And in Europe, it's still a reasonably well-paid job. And there was a period of a couple of months where I dated a co-worker. And she was a few years my senior in terms of how long she'd been a controller. And accordingly, she made a chunk more money than I did. And although it never caused any big arguments, today's topic does remind me of how I felt that I wasn't in the traditional role of being the bank in the relationship. And I had to be so careful not to let my pride get in the way of our plans when she insisted upon, going to certain restaurants or certain bars that she knew were outside my budget, because my current account couldn't stretch to that as a trainee or, a low hours controller. But she would always insist that she wanted to pay because she earned more and she wanted to go to those places. So she was being purely logical, and I had to be very careful because there were just periods where I got stuck with my ego. But what if the provider role isn't fundamentally about money, and actually it's more about responsibility? Just the providing the money is just the means to show we have the responsibility. So evolutionary psychologist David Buss has written about how across cultures, women do tend to prioritize partners who demonstrate stability and resource acquisition capability. So they're able to, get more money. But resourcefulness isn't only income. It can be competence. It can be reliability. And that might be the core issue, that perhaps men don't crave being the sole provider. They just crave being needed. So one of the most powerful theories of psychology is known as self-determination theory. And it suggests that humans need autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So the provider role historically delivered all three of those for men. They got autonomy through doing work. They achieved competence through mastery, by improving at their work. And their relatedness was via support for the family. So if we remove the structure, but we don't replace the needs, men are going to drift. And that to me opens up a new question, which is so much more than the relevance of the role. And it's, how do men experience competence and contribution in a world where money is no longer that sole marker? So in an attempt to modernize masculinity, some narratives have unintentionally framed ambition, earning, and dominance as inherently toxic. But being ambitious isn't toxic. Irresponsibility with that ambition is. Trying to maintain control is not toxic. Abuse of that control is. And providing certainly isn't toxic, but entitlement is. And having an idea, if men are told your traditional role is oppressive because you're trying to take too much control, if they're not shown a compelling alternative, they don't become enlightened. They just become a bit confused, or worse, reactive. And confusion rarely produces stable masculinity. Well, confusion rarely produces stable anything, but certainly we won't get stable masculinity if we're confused. And I think I have always had the traditional mindset of providing, having an excess, not having financial pressure. All those things meant I was doing okay. I had my shit together. But sometimes in order to achieve those things, work has taken my attention, my presence would suffer. But I think it's a nonsense, because what's the point in providing for, say, your family and you're not a consistent member because you're basically just the sponsor of the team. Like you've just got your logos on the shirt, your name's on the shirt, but that's about it. So I think a part of my journey, I've grown to realize that pride has some use, but it can really, really impede growth. And it returns to the idea of not caring about what society thinks, only the opinions of those close to me that I care about. To the point that if I had, not necessarily a rich wife, but if I had a wife that had the means to bankroll my life, which meant I could work less and be more present, although the younger me wouldn't have been able to cope with that situation, now I genuinely would have zero shame about that. If someone tried to embarrass me by telling me I'm a fucking deadbeat or something, I'd say I'd laugh it off now. And like my presence is the present. I know that's a really corny line, but it does make so much sense to me. Because, if we click as a team and we tick all of our boxes of happiness, who's putting more into the bank account is basically fucking irrelevant. It doesn't matter what their gender is. Happiness and joy is the goal. And I suppose perhaps if I really want to wind this person up, I'll call them a bigot for having such an outdated view. But honestly, I just wouldn't care. I would have so little shame. And it begs the question, is the provider role outdated? And if we look at it from a purely economic standpoint, yeah, in its rigid form, it is. But psychologically, probably not, because men still need to feel competent, they need to feel necessary, and they need to be able to show that they're capable of carrying weight. So maybe providing in 2026 doesn't mean I'm the sole breadwinner. Maybe it means providing stability, providing leadership, providing some level of emotional security, providing discipline, providing consistency. And maybe it's less about who earns and more about whether both partners feel respected and valued. So for me, the healthiest masculinity moving forward is not about clinging to outdated hierarchies or abandoning responsibility altogether. For me, it's about redefining provision as contribution, not control. Because at the end of the day, most men don't want power. They just want purpose. So thanks again for listening to another bonus episode from the Men We Are podcast. Hopefully some thought-provoking stuff for you. I look forward to having you join me on the next episode. And until then, I wish you a good few days and I wish you the best of luck.